What if the reason your life feels slightly off lately isn't because you're tired or lost or even burned out, but because some version of you, is trying to pull you in a completely different direction? I want you to think about this for a second. Have you ever walked into your job, looked around, and felt this quiet, almost unsettling thought in the back of your mind? This isn't where I'm supposed to be. Not loud, not dramatic, just there. Or maybe you've been making decent money, doing everything you were told would make you feel secure, and yet at night, when everything goes quiet, there's this strange emptiness that you can't explain. And the weird part is, nothing is technically wrong. Your life, on paper, makes sense. But something inside you keeps whispering that it doesn't feel right. And here's where it gets even stranger. What if that feeling isn't confusion, but communication? What if it's not that you're breaking down, but that something deeper is breaking through? Because most people assume that when they feel disconnected, it means something is wrong with them. But what if the opposite is true? What if that discomfort, that restlessness, that subtle sense that your life doesn't fully belong to you anymore, is actually a signal? A signal from a version of you that already exists, one that made different choices, one that stepped into a completely different life, one that became who you've been quietly trying to become. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something out of a movie. Parallel versions of you, different realities. But stay with me, because the idea isn't as far-fetched as it seems. Think about this. Every major decision you've ever made, every job you took, every relationship you entered or walked away from, each one could have gone a different way. And if even one of those choices changed, your entire life would look different right now. So the question is, where did those other possibilities go? Did they just disappear? Or do they exist somewhere else, unfolding in ways you can't see, but maybe can feel? And here's the part most people miss. If those versions exist, they're not completely separate from you. Because if they were, you wouldn't feel anything. But you do feel something. That pull, that tension, that quiet knowing that there's more, and you're not living it yet. And maybe, just maybe, that feeling isn't random. Maybe it's the closest thing you have to a message. A message that doesn't come through words, but through emotions, through discomfort, through moments where reality itself feels slightly out of alignment. And if that's true, then everything you've been calling burnout, or overthinking, or losing motivation, might actually be something else entirely. But before we go deeper into this, if this kind of perspective speaks to something inside you, if you've ever felt like there's more to reality than what you've been told, make sure you subscribe to the channel, The Inner Code, because we're going to explore ideas that most people never even question, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. Now, here's the real question. What if the signs have already been showing up in your life, and you just didn't recognize them for what they are? And if those signs have already been showing up in your life, then the first place they reveal themselves is not in some dramatic, cinematic moment, but in the quiet, almost invisible cracks in your everyday reality that most people ignore. It usually starts with something so subtle that you almost dismiss it, like the growing sense that your routine is no longer neutral. It is draining you in a way you cannot fully explain, like waking up on a Monday morning and feeling a weight that is heavier than just lack of sleep, heavier than stress, almost like your body is resisting something your mind is still trying to justify. You tell yourself it is normal. Everyone feels this way. This is just what adulthood looks like. But deep down there is a friction that does not go away, a silent tension between what you are doing and what something inside you knows you could be doing instead. And then it expands into other areas of your life, not all at once, but gradually, like a slow shift that you only notice when you pause long enough to feel it. You might be sitting in traffic, looking at the same streets you have driven through 100 times, and suddenly everything feels strangely distant, like you are watching your own life instead of living it. Like there is a version of you somewhere else that is not stuck in this moment, not repeating this same pattern, and for a brief second, you feel that version more strongly than the one you are currently in. Most people brush this off as distraction or fatigue, but what if it is neither? What if it is a moment where the boundary between versions becomes thin enough for you to sense that there is more than one path, more than one outcome, more than one identity available to you? Because here is what nobody really tells you. The feeling of being out of place in your own life is not always a sign that you are failing. Sometimes it is a sign that you have outgrown the version of yourself that your current reality is still trying to hold you in. And when that happens, reality does not immediately change. Instead, it starts to feel uncomfortable, misaligned, almost like wearing clothes that no longer fit, but you keep trying to convince yourself they do. You begin to notice small things, like conversations that used to excite you now feel empty, goals that once motivated you now feel forced, and even the way you think starts to shift, as if your inner dialogue is no longer fully synchronized with the life you are living. This is where most people get confused, because nothing external has collapsed. There is no clear reason to leave, no obvious sign to change direction, and yet internally everything feels like it is slowly drifting apart. And this is exactly why these moments are so powerful, because they are easy to ignore, easy to rationalize, easy to suppress. But they carry a very specific signal, one that does not come from your environment, but from a deeper layer of your own consciousness that is trying to recalibrate you. It is not loud. It does not force you. It simply creates a persistent feeling that something is not fully aligned. And the longer you ignore it, the stronger that feeling becomes, not as punishment, but as pressure, like a gentle but constant pull guiding you towards something you cannot fully see yet, but somehow recognize. And if you have been feeling this lately, that quiet dissatisfaction, that subtle disconnection, that sense that your life is not completely wrong, but not completely right either, then you are already closer to understanding what is really happening than you think. And the moment you begin to sense that quiet misalignment, something else happens that most people completely misunderstand. Because what feels like confusion is actually the breaking point of an old belief about reality itself. You have been taught your entire life that what you see is what is real, that your job defines your direction, that your circumstances define your possibilities, and that your past decisions lock you into a fixed path. But what if that entire framework is incomplete? What if reality is not something you are trapped inside of, but something you are constantly selecting from, moment by moment, based on something much deeper than logic? Because here is the shift that changes everything. The idea that reality is not a single, solid structure, but a field of possibilities, and your awareness, your attention, your internal state acts like a filter that determines which version of that field becomes your experience. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because if that is true, then the external world you are living in is not just happening to you. It is reflecting something within you, something subtle, something often unconscious, but something active nonetheless. Think about it in the simplest way. Have you ever noticed how two people can go through almost identical situations and walk away with completely different outcomes? Not because the situation changed, but because their perception, their expectations, their internal dialogue shaped how they move through it? One person sees opportunity, the other sees limitation, one takes action, the other hesitates, and over time those small internal differences create completely different realities. Now take that idea and expand it, not just to behavior, but to the level of identity itself, because your identity is not fixed. It is a state you are continuously reinforcing through thought, emotion, and focus. And if your identity shifts, even slightly, your decisions begin to shift, your reactions begin to shift, and eventually your entire life begins to reorganize around that new state. But here is the part most people miss. This process does not start externally. It starts internally, often long before anything visible changes. That feeling you had, that sense that something is off, is not random. It is the first indication that your internal state is no longer aligned with the version of reality you are currently experiencing. It is like your mind is tuned to one frequency while your life is still playing on another, and that gap creates tension, discomfort, and a growing sense that you need to move, even if you do not know where yet. And instead of recognizing this as a natural transition, most people try to force themselves back into alignment with their current reality. They push through, they ignore the feeling, they convince themselves that stability is more important than truth. But the more they do that, the stronger the internal resistance becomes. Because you cannot unknow what you have started to feel. You cannot return to a previous version of yourself once something deeper has been activated. And this is why this stage feels so strange, because nothing external confirms what is happening. There is no clear sign, no visible proof, just an internal shift that does not match your environment anymore. But what if that is exactly the point? What if the shift always begins within, and the external world simply takes time to catch up? Because if reality truly reflects your internal state, then the moment that state begins to change, even slightly, the version of reality you are connected to begins to change as well, even if you cannot see it yet. And maybe, just maybe, that is not something to fear, but something to pay very close attention to. And if the external world takes time to catch up with your internal shift, then the most important question becomes this: what is it inside of you that is actually changing? Because this is where everything starts to turn from confusion into clarity, when you realize that what is shifting is not just your mood or your motivation, but your entire sense of identity, the way you see yourself, the way you interpret your life, and most importantly, the version of you that you believe you are allowed to become. You might not notice it all at once, but it shows up in small, almost unexplainable ways, like no longer being able to tolerate things you once accepted without question, like conversations that feel shallow, environments that feel heavy, or goals that suddenly feel disconnected from who you are becoming. And it is not because those things are objectively wrong. It is because they belong to a version of you that is slowly dissolving. This is the part that feels uncomfortable, because identity is not something we think about often, but it is the foundation of everything, every decision you make, every opportunity you pursue or ignore, every relationship you stay in or walk away from. All of it is filtered through who you believe you are. And when that belief starts to shift, even slightly, your entire life begins to feel unstable, not because something is broken, but because something deeper is reorganizing. It is like your internal world is updating before your external world has had a chance to reflect it, and that gap creates a strange in-between state where you no longer feel like your old self, but you are not fully connected to your new self yet either. And this is where most people panic, because this space feels uncertain. It feels like you are losing control, like you are drifting without direction. But what if this space is actually necessary? What if this is the exact point where transformation becomes possible? Because you cannot step into a new version of your life while still holding on to the identity that created your current one. Something has to loosen, something has to fall away, and that process does not feel clean or comfortable. It feels like confusion, like doubt, like questioning everything you thought you wanted. But here is what most people never realize. This is not random. This is structured. There is a pattern to it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The pattern is this: your internal identity shifts first, then your perception changes, then your behavior changes, and only after that does your external reality begin to rearrange itself. And if you interrupt that process too early, if you force yourself back into your old identity just to feel stable again, you end up staying in a life that no longer fits you, not because you have to, but because you did not allow the transition to complete. And this is where the idea of a parallel version of you becomes more than just an abstract concept. Because if there are multiple versions of you, then each one represents a different identity, a different way of thinking, a different way of being, and the moment you start to shift internally, you are essentially moving closer to one of those versions and further away from another. You are not jumping instantly. You are transitioning, gradually, subtly, through changes in how you see yourself and what you believe is possible for your life. And maybe that is why this feels so personal, because it is not just about changing circumstances. It is about becoming someone else, someone who thinks differently, feels differently, and therefore experiences a completely different version of reality. And if that is what is happening, then the discomfort you feel is not something to escape. It is something to understand, because it might be the clearest signal that you are already in the process of becoming that next version of yourself. And if you are already in the process of becoming that next version of yourself, then here is the part that changes everything. The realization that somewhere, in a way you cannot physically see but can deeply sense, there is already a version of you who has completed this transition. A version of you who made the decisions you are hesitating to make, who walked away when you stayed, who took the risk when you played it safe, who chose alignment over comfort, and is now living a life that, right now, still feels just out of reach for you. And the strange thing is, when you really sit with that idea, it does not feel completely foreign, it feels familiar, almost like remembering something rather than imagining it. You might catch glimpses of it in quiet moments, like when you randomly picture yourself living somewhere else, doing something different, surrounded by a completely different environment, and for a second, it feels real, not like a fantasy, but like a memory from a life you have not lived yet. Or when you feel this sudden clarity about what you should be doing, followed almost immediately by doubt that pulls you back into your current reality. That back and forth, that tension between knowing and hesitation, is not just indecision. It is the space between two versions of you, one that is still tied to your current identity and one that has already moved beyond it. And most people think that future versions of themselves are something they have to create from scratch. But what if that is not entirely true? What if those versions already exist as potential states, and your life is less about building something new and more about aligning with something that is already there? Because if you think about it, every skill you have ever developed, every mindset you have ever adopted, every breakthrough you have ever experienced, it all started as something that felt unfamiliar, something that felt like it belonged to a different version of you, until one day it became natural. So what if this is just a larger version of that same process? What if the person you are trying to become is not a distant goal, but a version of you that is already fully formed, waiting for you to match its level of thinking, its level of awareness, its level of belief? And if that is the case, then the signals you are experiencing, the discomfort, the misalignment, the sense that something is calling you forward, are not random at all. They are indicators that you are getting closer to that version. But here is where it goes deeper, because that version of you is not passive. It is not just sitting there waiting. It is influencing you in the only way it can, through your internal experience. Not through words, not through direct messages, but through intuition, through sudden shifts in perspective, through moments where something inside you becomes so clear that you cannot ignore it, even if you try. And this is why it feels so personal, because it is coming from you, not the version of you that is limited by your current circumstances, but the version of you that has already expanded beyond them. And if you pay attention, you start to notice a pattern. The more you lean into that feeling, the more things begin to align in subtle ways. New ideas appear, different opportunities show up, your reactions change, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, your life begins to shift direction. But the moment you ignore it, the moment you dismiss it as unrealistic or impractical, that sense of alignment fades, and you feel pulled back into your old patterns again. And maybe that is the clearest sign of all, not something you see with your eyes, but something you feel within yourself, the difference between being aligned and being disconnected. And if that difference exists, if you can feel it, then it means there is something real behind it, something guiding you, not from outside, but from a deeper version of who you already are. And if that deeper version of you is influencing your internal experience in subtle ways, then this is where most people completely overlook the most important mechanism behind it all. Because it is not just about feeling different, it is about understanding how that difference actually begins to reshape your reality. Because here is what is happening beneath the surface. Your attention, what you focus on, what you emotionally react to, what you keep replaying in your mind, is not neutral. It is directional. It is constantly guiding the flow of your experience, even when you are not aware of it. Think about how your mind works throughout the day, what you dwell on, what you worry about, what you imagine, what you replay over and over again, and how those patterns start to shape your mood, your decisions, and eventually your actions. It feels automatic, like you are just reacting to life, but in reality, your attention is acting like a filter, amplifying certain possibilities while fading others into the background. And this is where it gets deeper, because your attention is not just selecting what you notice, it is influencing what becomes more real in your experience. When you focus on stress, you start to notice more things that confirm that stress. When you focus on lack, you become more sensitive to what is missing. And when you focus on possibility, even slightly, you begin to see openings that were always there but previously invisible to you. This is not about forcing positivity or pretending everything is perfect. It is about recognizing that your internal focus is directly tied to the version of reality you are tuning into. And if there are multiple versions of you, each aligned with different states of thinking and feeling, then your attention becomes the bridge between where you are and where you could be. The version of you that feels stuck is not just living a different life. It is paying attention to different things, interpreting situations differently, and reinforcing a completely different internal narrative. And the version of you that feels aligned, fulfilled, and clear is doing the same, but in a way that creates expansion instead of contraction. So the question becomes, which one are you feeding? Because even without making a dramatic external change, the way you direct your attention begins to shift your internal state, and that shift, over time, starts to reorganize your behavior and your environment. But here is the part that most people struggle with, because they think change has to start with a big action, quitting the job, ending the relationship, moving to a new place. But what if those actions are actually the result, not the cause? What if the real shift begins in something much quieter, much less visible, like the way you interpret your current situation, the meaning you assign to your experiences, and the thoughts you choose to engage with instead of automatically believing them? Because the moment you start to observe your own attention, instead of being completely controlled by it, something changes, you create space. And in that space, you are no longer locked into one version of yourself. You begin to see that your reactions are not fixed, your identity is not fixed, and the path you are on is not as permanent as it feels. And maybe that is the real signal, not just the discomfort or the misalignment, but the growing awareness that you have more influence over your experience than you were ever taught to believe, and that the version of you are becoming is not something you are chasing, but something you are slowly aligning with, one shift in attention at a time. And if your attention is the bridge between different versions of yourself, then what you begin to notice next is something that feels almost too precise to be random, because it shows up in the patterns of your life in ways that are subtle, but impossible to completely ignore once you see them. It might start with something as simple as repetition, the same idea appearing in different places, the same type of opportunity showing up when you were not even looking for it, or the same conversation coming up with different people in completely unrelated situations. At first, you brush it off as coincidence, just the brain making connections where there are none, but then it keeps happening, and not in a chaotic way, but in a strangely organized way, almost like something is trying to get your attention without forcing it. You might think about changing your career, and suddenly you hear someone talking about a path you have never considered before, or you scroll past something online that feels oddly specific to what you were just thinking about. And for a moment, it feels like life is responding to you, not in a dramatic or magical way, but in a quiet, almost conversational way. And this is where it becomes difficult to explain, because it is not something you can prove, it is something you experience, and once you experience it enough times, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like alignment. But here is where most people disconnect from it, because the moment something feels unfamiliar or uncertain, the mind immediately tries to bring it back to what is known, what is safe, what is predictable. It tells you that you are overthinking, that you are reading too much into things, that you should stay grounded in what is practical and proven. And to a certain extent, that voice is trying to protect you. But it is also the same voice that keeps you locked into the same patterns, the same outcomes, the same version of yourself. Because the version of you that is expanding does not always feel logical at first. It feels uncertain. It feels undefined. It feels like stepping into something without having all the answers. And that is exactly why the signs do not come as clear instructions. They come as nudges, as patterns, as moments that catch your attention just enough to make you pause and question what is really going on. And if you follow those moments, even slightly, you begin to notice that they are not random at all. They tend to point in a consistent direction, not necessarily toward a specific outcome, but toward a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing yourself and your life. It is like your reality starts to reorganize around the questions you are beginning to ask, the awareness you are beginning to develop, and the version of yourself you are starting to move toward. And maybe that is the real nature of these signs, not messages in the traditional sense, but reflections of the shift that is already happening within you, appearing externally in ways that mirror your internal state. And the more you pay attention to them, the more they seem to appear, not because something outside of you is increasing them, but because your awareness is becoming more refined, more sensitive, more aligned with something deeper. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether the signs are real, but whether you are willing to notice them, to trust them just enough to explore where they might be leading, even if you cannot fully explain how or why they are showing up in the first place. And if your awareness is becoming more refined, more sensitive to these patterns, then what begins to happen next is something even more subtle, something that does not just show up around you, but starts to change how you experience yourself from within. It is no longer just about noticing external signs or repeating patterns. It becomes something more internal, more personal, like your perception itself is shifting in a way you cannot fully reverse. You start to catch yourself thinking differently, not because you are trying to, but because certain thoughts no longer feel true in the way they used to. Old fears that once controlled your decisions begin to feel weaker, not gone, but less convincing, like they are losing their authority over you. And at the same time, new ideas begin to emerge, ideas that feel unfamiliar but strangely certain, as if they are coming from a place deeper than your usual thinking. You might find yourself questioning things you never questioned before, like why you are living the way you are living, why you accepted certain limitations, why you stayed in situations that no longer feel aligned. And this questioning does not feel forced. It feels natural, almost inevitable, like something inside you has reached a point where it can no longer pretend that your current version of reality is the only option available. But here is where it becomes even more interesting, because as your perception shifts, your emotional responses begin to shift as well. Situations that used to trigger you start to feel less intense, and things that once seemed important begin to lose their grip on you. It is not that you stop caring, it is that you start seeing differently, and that new perspective changes what matters and what is not. You may notice moments where you respond in a way that surprises even you, choosing calm instead of reaction, clarity instead of confusion, or distance instead of attachment. And in those moments, it feels like you are briefly stepping into a different version of yourself, one that is not driven by the same patterns, one that sees more clearly, one that moves with a different kind of awareness. But here is the part that most people overlook. These moments are not random. They are previews, small glimpses into the version of you that you are moving toward. They are not permanent yet. They come and go. But each time they happen, they leave an impression, a sense that there is another way of being that feels more aligned, more natural, even if it is not fully stable yet. And the more you experience these shifts, the harder it becomes to fully return to your old way of thinking, because once you have seen a different perspective, even briefly, you cannot completely unsee it. And this is where the process deepens, because now it is no longer just about noticing signs or patterns. It is about recognizing that your internal world is actively evolving, that your thoughts, your emotions, and your perception are all reorganizing in subtle but meaningful ways. And if that is happening, then it suggests something important, that the version of you are becoming is not something distant or abstract. It is already beginning to take shape within you, influencing how you think, how you feel, and how you experience your reality, even before anything on the outside has fully changed. And maybe that is the clearest signal of all, not something you can point to externally, but something you can feel internally, the quiet but undeniable sense that you are no longer the same person you were, and that something new is already beginning to emerge from within you. And if something new is already beginning to emerge within you, then the next thing you may start to notice is not just a shift in how you think or feel, but a shift in how you relate to the world around you, especially in the spaces that once felt familiar and stable. This is where the process becomes even more visible, because it starts to affect your external life in ways that are subtle at first, but deeply meaningful. You may find yourself in the same job, sitting at the same desk, going through the same routines, but something about it feels fundamentally different, like you are no longer fully connected to it, like you are observing it from a slight distance rather than being completely immersed in it. It is not that the job suddenly became worse. It is that you are no longer the same person experiencing it in the same way. And this creates a kind of internal friction, because part of you still tries to function as you always have, while another part of you is quietly pulling away, questioning, reassessing, and searching for something that feels more aligned. The same thing can happen in relationships, where nothing dramatic has changed on the surface, but the connection feels different, not necessarily broken, but altered, like you are no longer meeting each other from the same place you once did. Conversations that used to flow easily may now feel forced. Shared interests may begin to fade, and there is a subtle awareness that you are no longer growing in the same direction. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable, because there is no clear conflict to point to, no obvious reason to walk away, just a feeling that something is no longer in sync. But what if this is not a problem to fix, but a signal to understand? Because when your internal state shifts, your external environment does not instantly rearrange itself. Instead, it reveals where the misalignment exists. It shows you which parts of your life still reflect your old identity and which parts are beginning to resonate with who you are becoming. And this is why these experiences can feel so confusing, because you are essentially living between two versions of yourself at the same time, one that is still connected to your current reality and one that is already moving towards something else. And the more you become aware of this, the more difficult it becomes to ignore it, because you start to see the patterns more clearly. You start to recognize where you are acting out of habit versus where you are responding from a deeper sense of alignment. And this awareness changes how you move through your life, even if you do not make any immediate external changes. You might begin to set different boundaries, to speak more honestly, to step back from situations that no longer feel right, not because you have all the answers, but because something inside you no longer allows you to fully participate in what feels misaligned. And at the same time, you may start to feel drawn toward things that you cannot fully explain, new interests, new ideas, new directions that seem to appear out of nowhere, but feel strangely compelling. And this is where it becomes clear that the process is not just internal or external. It is both. It is a continuous interaction between who you are becoming and the reality you are experiencing. And if you pay attention, you will notice that the more you honor that internal shift, even in small ways, the more your external world begins to respond, not all at once, but gradually, like pieces starting to move into place. And maybe that is the deeper pattern behind all of this, that the changes you are experiencing are not random disruptions, but part of a larger realignment, one that is guiding you away from what no longer reflects who you are and towards something that does, even if you cannot fully see it yet. And if your external world is slowly beginning to respond to your internal shift, then what emerges next is something even more undeniable, something that goes beyond patterns and feelings and starts to reshape the way your life actually unfolds in real time. Because at this stage, it is no longer just about subtle misalignment or quiet awareness. It becomes visible through the decisions you are being pushed toward, the ones that feel both right and uncomfortable at the same time. You might notice that you can no longer delay certain choices the way you used to, that what once felt optional now feels urgent, not in a stressful way, but in a deeply intuitive way, like something inside you is no longer willing to stay where it does not belong. And this is where the experience becomes more intense, because now you are not just observing the shift, you are being asked to participate in it. It shows up in moments where you feel a clear pull to speak honestly instead of staying quiet, to step away instead of holding on, to move forward instead of waiting for perfect certainty. And the strange part is, these moments often do not come with full clarity. They come with a sense of knowing that does not rely on logic, a kind of internal certainty that feels real even when it cannot be fully explained. This is where most people hesitate, because they are waiting for external confirmation, for a clear sign that guarantees the outcome. But what if that confirmation never comes in the way you expect? What if the only real signal is the one you already feel, the one that keeps returning no matter how many times you try to ignore it? Because the version of you that is aligned does not operate from hesitation. It operates from clarity, not perfect clarity about every detail, but clarity about direction, about what feels true and what no longer does. And this is where the idea of a parallel version of you becomes something you can actually sense in your daily life, not as a concept, but as a contrast. You begin to feel the difference between the choices that keep you in your current pattern and the choices that move you toward something new. One feels heavy, repetitive, and familiar. The other feels uncertain, expansive, and alive. And even though the familiar choice feels safer, it also feels like it is slowly draining something from you, while the uncertain choice, even with all its unknowns, feels like it is giving something back. And this is the moment where everything starts to shift, because now you are no longer just noticing signs. You are standing at the point where those signs are asking something of you. They are asking whether you are willing to trust what you feel over what you have always known, whether you are willing to move without guarantees, whether you are willing to let go of an identity that no longer fits in order to step into one that has not fully formed yet. And this is not an easy process, because it requires you to sit with uncertainty, to face the possibility of change without controlling every outcome. But it is also where real transformation begins. Because the moment you act from that deeper sense of alignment, even in small ways, something changes, not just externally, but internally. Your confidence shifts, your awareness expands, and you begin to see yourself differently. And once that happens, it becomes harder and harder to go back to the version of yourself that was living on autopilot, because now you have experienced what it feels like to move with intention instead of habit. And maybe that is the real turning point in all of this, not the signs themselves, but what you choose to do when you recognize them. Because in that moment, you are not just observing your reality, you are actively shaping it, one decision at a time. And if you have reached the point where your decisions are beginning to shift your reality, then what you may start to feel next is something even more intense, something that many people misunderstand and often try to resist, because it does not feel like progress at first. It feels like discomfort, like emotional turbulence, like a strange mix of clarity and confusion happening at the same time. You might find yourself feeling more sensitive than usual, reacting more deeply to things that once seemed small, or feeling overwhelmed by situations that you used to handle without much thought. And this can be confusing, because you would expect growth to feel empowering, stable, and clear, but instead, it can feel like everything is being shaken up internally. But what if this is not a setback? What if this is actually a sign that something deeper is being reorganized within you? Because when your internal state begins to shift at a fundamental level, it does not just change your thoughts, it begins to affect your emotional patterns, the way you process experiences, the way you respond to the world around you. Old emotions that you thought you had moved past may resurface, not because you are going backward, but because they are being brought into awareness in a new way, giving you the opportunity to see them differently, to release them instead of unconsciously carrying them forward. And this process can feel intense, because it requires you to face parts of yourself that you may have avoided, patterns that no longer align with who you are becoming, but are still present within you. It is like your system is recalibrating, letting go of what no longer fits so that something new can take its place. And during this time, it is easy to think that something is wrong, that you are losing control, that you are becoming unstable, but in reality, you are becoming more aware, more connected to what is happening within you. And this awareness can feel overwhelming at first, because you are no longer operating on autopilot. You are seeing things more clearly, feeling things more deeply, and that level of clarity comes with intensity. But here is the part that most people miss. This intensity is temporary. It is part of the transition, not the destination. It is the process of your internal world adjusting to a new level of alignment, a new way of being that is more consistent with the version of you that you are moving toward. And if you can stay present through this, if you can allow yourself to feel without immediately trying to fix or escape it, something begins to shift. The intensity starts to settle, the clarity becomes more stable, and what once felt overwhelming begins to feel natural. And in that shift, you start to notice something important. You are no longer reacting in the same way you used to. You are no longer controlled by the same patterns. And there is a growing sense of space between what you feel and how you respond. And in that space, you have a choice that was not as visible before, the choice to respond from alignment instead of habit. And maybe that is the deeper meaning behind this phase. Not that you are being overwhelmed, but that you are being open to a new level of awareness, a new level of control, a new level of connection with yourself. And if that is true, then the discomfort you feel is not something to fear. It is something to move through, because on the other side of it is a version of you that is no longer driven by the same unconscious patterns, but by something much more intentional, much more aligned, and much more real. And if you begin to move through that intensity instead of resisting it, then something remarkable starts to happen, something that does not come from forcing change, but from allowing a new level of alignment to stabilize within you. Because at this stage, it is no longer about questioning everything or feeling overwhelmed by the process. It becomes about integration, about learning how to live from this new awareness in a way that feels grounded, real, and sustainable. You start to notice that the clarity you once experienced in brief moments is now lasting longer, not perfectly, but enough to guide your decisions in a more consistent way. The emotional swings begin to soften, the inner noise becomes quieter, and in its place, there is a growing sense of calm certainty, not about every outcome, but about yourself, about what feels right and what does not. And this is where the shift becomes practical, because now it is not just something you feel internally. It begins to show up in how you move through your daily life. You may start to simplify things, letting go of unnecessary stress, stepping away from situations that drain you, choosing to focus on what actually matters instead of what you were conditioned to chase. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, but it is intentional. And the more you act from this place, the more your life begins to reorganize itself around that intention. Opportunities that once felt distant start to feel accessible, not because the world suddenly changed, but because you are engaging with it differently. You are no longer reacting from old patterns. You are responding from a place of awareness, and that changes everything. But here is where it becomes even more important to stay present, because this phase can create the illusion that the work is done, that you have reached some final state, when in reality, this is just the beginning of a more conscious way of living. The difference now is that you are no longer moving blindly. You are aware of your influence, aware of how your internal state shapes your experience, and that awareness comes with responsibility. It means that you can no longer fully blame your circumstances for how your life unfolds, because you can see the connection between your inner world and your external reality more clearly than before. And while that might feel like pressure at first, it is also where your power comes from. Because if your internal state can shape your experience, then you are not as limited as you once believed. You have the ability to shift, to realign, to choose differently, not just once, but continuously. And this is what makes this stage so important, because it is where you learn to trust yourself, not in a blind or naive way, but in a grounded, aware way that comes from experience. You begin to recognize your own patterns, your own tendencies, and instead of being controlled by them, you learn to work with them, to adjust, to refine, to move in a way that feels more aligned with who you are becoming. And over time, this creates something deeper than just change. It creates stability, not the kind of stability that comes from staying the same, but the kind that comes from being able to adapt without losing your sense of self. And maybe that is what this entire process has been leading you toward, not just a different life, but a different way of living, one where you are no longer disconnected from yourself, but actively participating in the creation of your experience, moment by moment, with a level of awareness that you did not have before. And if you have reached this point, where your awareness is no longer something temporary, but something you are beginning to live through, then the final realization is not about discovering something new, but about finally seeing what has been there all along in a completely different way. Because maybe the idea of a parallel version of you was never meant to be taken as something distant or separate, but as a way of helping you understand a deeper truth about your own experience, that the life you are living is not fixed, and that who you are being in each moment is shaping what becomes real for you. And when you really sit with that, not as a concept, but as something you feel in your own life, it changes how you see everything. Because you start to realize that the signs were never about something outside of you trying to reach in. They were reflections of something within you trying to emerge. The discomfort, the patterns, the shifts in perception, the emotional intensity, all of it was part of a process guiding you toward alignment, not forcing you, not controlling you, but inviting you to become more aware of the direction you are already moving in. And the deeper lesson in all of this is simple, but not always easy to accept. You are not stuck, you are not lost, and you are not waiting for life to change before you can move forward. You are already in motion, already transitioning, already shaping your reality through the way you think, feel, and respond, even in ways you did not notice before. And once you see that, even a little bit, you cannot go back to believing that your life is something that just happens to you. You begin to understand that your internal state is not separate from your external experience. It is the foundation of it. And the way you apply this in your life does not require dramatic action or sudden transformation. It starts with something much more grounded and practical, paying attention to how you feel in different situations, noticing where you feel aligned and where you feel resistance, and instead of ignoring those signals, using them as information. When something feels consistently heavy, draining, or disconnected, it is not something to push through blindly. It is something to understand, to question, to explore. And when something feels expansive, clear, or quietly right, even if it is uncertain, that is something to lean into, even in small ways. It can be as simple as choosing a different response in a conversation, setting a boundary you would have ignored before, or giving yourself space to consider a new direction without immediately shutting it down. These small shifts might not seem significant at first, but over time, they compound, and they begin to reshape your experience in ways that are both subtle and profound. And that is the real power in all of this, not the idea of parallel realities or hidden messages, but the realization that you have more influence over your life than you were ever taught to believe, and that by becoming more aware of your internal state, you begin to naturally align with a version of reality that reflects it. So here is a simple question I want you to think about. What is one area of your life right now that feels slightly off, even if you cannot fully explain why? I would really like to hear your perspective, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes hearing how others are experiencing this can help you see your own situation more clearly. And if this video gave you a new way to look at your life, consider subscribing to The Inner Code, because there is so much more to explore, and your support helps keep this journey going.